In the spring of 1190, crusaders from the Low German trading towns of Lübeck and Bremen reached the Christian siege army outside Acre. Under the leadership of King Philip II of France and King Richard the Lionheart, the participants of the so-called Third Crusade were attempting to conquer the Mediterranean city that had been lost to Saladin some years prior. Among the crowded Christians camped on the Tauron Plateau, hygienic conditions were catastrophic and disease was rampant. As a gesture of mercy, the new German arrivals formed a field hospital by turning the sail and riggings from one of their ships into tarpaulins to provide shade to those suffering from illness. According to tradition, this was the founding moment of the Ordo Fratum Domus Hospitalis Sanctae Mariae Teutonicorum Hierosolymitanorum, or in short, the Teutonic Order. Hardly any of those charitable Germans would have reckoned with the fact that their actions off Acre on the warm Mediterranean coast would lead a few decades later to the creation of a powerful dominion in the distant and cold Prussian lands. Welcome to our first video on the origins and history of the Teutonic Order, in which we will present a primer on this iconic brotherhood of medieval German knights, discussing its structure and the basic concept of its rule in Prussia. We'll be learning about the inner workings of the Teutonic Order in detail. But do you also want to see the inner workings of thousands of modern military vehicles? You certainly will when you see what's on offer in our sponsor, War Thunder. It's a free vehicle combat game that brings the most comprehensive simulation of machine combat ever attempted. First of all, you can choose to fight in anything from a 1920s biplane to a modern main battle tank, with 2,500 vehicles from 10 major nations. And once you're in there, you'll find the designs, sounds, and performance of these machines are absolutely authentic. The best demonstration of this detail is the damage modeling. The internal components and crew of everything from little armored cars to massive battleships will all be simulated, which is always amazing to watch with their X-ray view shots. You can join 70 million players for free on PlayStation, Xbox, or PC, and if you're a new player or haven't played for at least 6 months, you can also get a massive bonus pack for a limited time only by signing up using our link in the description below. That will get you an exclusive vehicle decorator and some free premium vehicles, among other perks. Just use our link below and get into the action with this extra bonus right now. Soon after the foundation of the field hospital in Acre, the institution received numerous donations and was recognized as a fully fledged hospital community by Pope Clement III in 1191. When Acre was reconquered by the Christians, the hospital was given a house in the city and granted a number of privileges that facilitated the work of caring for the sick and poor. However, the order was still a long way from being a mighty military order like the Knights Templar or the Knights of St. John. Nevertheless, the order rose quickly, and during the course of the so-called German Crusade from 1197 to 1198, it was converted into a military order at the instigation of German ecclesiastical dignitaries and recognized as such by the Pope a year later. This development made the order a force to be reckoned with within the Holy Land. As donations continued to roll in from Europe, the young Teutonic Brotherhood grew in influence and accumulated new members at exponential rates. This new military order took the rules of the Templar Knights as the basis of its own rules. It structured its organization along the example of the other big military orders. This, however, did not mean that the Teutons slavishly followed the precedents set by the other knightly brotherhoods. When circumstances required a different course, the Teutonic Order got creative. During the 13th century, the broad member structure of the Teutonic Order had established itself. The bulk of the order's membership was made up not of churchmen but of laypeople, who were broken up into several ranks. The highest rank in the Teutonic Order was the initiated Knight Brothers, iconic for their distinctive belted, white-capped appearance. These full-fledged members made up the elite military corps and political leadership of the order. Although these knights were largely drawn from the nobility, they in theory had to live without the noble pleasures and were expected to forego luxuries such as weddings and tournaments. Even hunting was restricted and only permitted for the purpose of training with ranged weapons. A new member had to be 15 years of age to become a Knight Brother. An aspiring brother had the right to try out life in the order for a year to see if it was suitable for him and leave if it wasn't, but he could also take the vows right away if he so pleased. Furthermore, the candidates had to be freeborn men without debts, nor could they be members of other orders. Initiates into the Teutonic Brotherhood were also not permitted to be married. These restrictions were imposed because the order had to take responsibility for the prior actions and incur liabilities of its new brother. For example, the order would have to pay for the new members' debts, settle their legal disputes, or, if the initiator was unfree, reach an agreement with their former master. If the initiate was a member of another religious order, a legal dispute under ecclesiastical law was necessary to determine if the new member was allowed to leave its old order via an ecclesiastical permission. If a married man wanted to become a Knight of the Teutonic Order, he had to acquire his wife's permission and had to prove that her livelihood was secured, or have her join him in the order. More on that later. The Graumantler, or Grey Cloaked, were lower-born but well-off laymen who existed one stratum below the Knight Brothers. They took on military duties as well as lower offices in the administration, and handled much of the day-to-day business of the order. The most important difference between the Grey Cloaked and the Knight Brothers was that they could not be knighted. The Graumantler were recruited from peasants or burghers and made up a large chunk of the order's membership in the early times. Despite their relatively lower prestige, they were still valued members of the community. During the election of the Grand Master of the Order, 4 Graumantler had to be present, which shows their importance. From the 14th century onwards, most of the Grey Cloaks seemed to have originated from the patrician families of the Prussian cities. The last caste in the Teutonic Order, made up primarily of lay people, were the Halbkreuzler, which translates to half-crosses. The Halbkreuzler were people who donated possessions, but either did not or could not be made full members of the order. Most of them appeared to have been landowners who worked the land that they donated themselves. Other members of the order were die Nendebruder and Nekter, who would perform the lowest duties for the order and its increasing possessions. As we suggested earlier, the Teutonic Order was not exclusively male, but had a female element to it as well. One female rank that played a core role in the order was the half-sisters. These women carried out duties in the hospitals, and also worked on the other possessions of the order, broadly functioning as the order's maidservants. Existing above the half-sisters was another predominantly female role, the sorores. These full sisters of the order came from noble families who made large donations to the order or followed their husbands or sons into the order. In both cases, they generally did not perform labour work other than charitable work in the hospitals. They were expected to be provided for by the order, especially as they got older. Having provided a breakdown of the Teutonic Order's lay people, let us now move on to the order's holy clergymen, known as the Spiritual Brothers. The Spiritual Brothers were made up of fully fledged ordained priests and other lower clerics. After the Teutonic Order became a military organization, the priests and churchmen within its ranks became secondary in importance to the militarized knights. Within the political hierarchy of the order, priests held less power than the knights. While they cared for the most important spiritual needs of the Knight Brothers, they usually did not rise up any higher than the lower offices within the order. However, although Spiritual Brothers could not gain high offices in the order, they could become influential bishops in the order's lands in Prussia and Livland, and act as important counselors for their Knight Brothers. According to the rule, members of the Teutonic Order were to treat their priests with the utmost respect. Moreover, priests had their own jurisdictional standing within the order. For example, when a member of the order failed in his oath or his duties, he had to declare this publicly. A priest's brother, on the other hand, could confess his wrongdoings in private. The basic unit of organization of the order was the Kommende, which was often alternatively referred to as a house, the German term for a house. Every Kommende was typically composed of at least 12 brothers, including at least one priest brother. In the regions of Central and Western Europe, the number of priest brothers would be higher than on the eastern frontiers of Christendom, where constant warfare necessitated a higher number of militarized Knight Brothers in each Kommende. After the year 1231, the Teutonic Order began its famous conquest of the Prussian lands that extended from the Baltic Sea down to the rivers Memel and Vistula. This conquest can be seen as part of the so-called Northern Crusades. These Christian endeavours started with the general crusading movement in the late 11th century and had the goal to subjugate the pagan tribes that still roamed the world around the Baltic Sea. The Prussians, or Prussen, were one such pagan tribe that belonged to the Baltic language group. They blessed Bishop Adalberg of Prague with martyrdom as early as 997, and afterwards had repeatedly warded off Christianization efforts and the Northern Crusades since the 11th century. On top of that, they became a nuisance for the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia in the early 13th century, who wanted to expand his sphere of influence. When the Teutonic Order was establishing its rule over the Prussian lands, it was able to rely on the established principles of the knightly orders. At its core, these principles were founded on the so-called three evangelical counsels, the commandments of chastity, obedience, and poverty. These principles, based on the Christian monastic tradition, enabled a practice of rule that differed drastically from that of a high medieval secular ruler who relied on the feudal system to rule his realm. Therefore, they often had no direct control over whom to give an office. To rule, the king had to take the different ranks of nobility and the aristocratic networks into account, which came on top of the often hereditary noble claims to fiefs, estates, and offices. So a medieval king always had to take the worldly and ecclesiastical nobles into account, who often formed an active opposition to him. The king therefore had to rule with the nobles, not against them. The order had none of this. Chastity meant that the Knight brothers could bear no children to pass their lands and titles to. Therefore, the offices within the order were not hereditary, and candidates were chosen by election. Obedience made it possible to transfer the brothers to posts and offices according to the needs of the institution. A clear hierarchy of authorized officers and recipients of orders could be established on the basis of these two statutes. At the same time, this prevented patronage, a common tool in medieval politics and social life. Finally, the commandment of poverty prevented enrichment through an office, as the member did not receive any money or other personal payments for his offices and duties. In theory, a brother owned nothing. From their clothes to their weapons, all items belonging to a member of the order were the property of the order. Thus, the Teutonic Order developed a relatively strict hierarchy that was also the basis for its rule of the land of Prussia. On top of this hierarchy was the Council of the Großgebietige, led by the Grand Master. After him came one of his closest advisors and the next highest office of the order, the Grand Comteur, also known as the Deputy of the Grand Master. On the same hierarchical level were the Order's Marshal, who was in charge of the army, the Großspittler, who was in charge of the Order's hospitals, the Tressler, who was in charge of the Order's finance, and the Trappier, who had to care for the clothing of the brothers. On the next hierarchical level came the Deutschmeister, who was in charge of all the possessions of the Order which lay within the Holy Roman Empire, and the Landmeister in Livland, who was the head of the Livonian branch of the Order. Theoretically, the Landmeister of Prussia had the same role for his region, but after the centre of the Order was relocated to Marienburg in Prussia in 1309, the office was fused with the Hochmeister. Further down the hierarchy were the Comteurs, the individual heads of the corresponding Komturen. After the Order conquered Prussia in the mid-13th century, it began to structure the subjugated region as it saw fit. The Order initially subdivided the region into Komtureien, each led by a Komtur, that stretched along the old tribal borders of the Prussians. The administrative core of a Komtureien or commandery was the castle-like Ordenshaus, the convents of the Order. Because of the nature of the conquest, and therefore the access to the land, these fortified convents were usually located on the outskirts of the commandery. Over time, the land of a Komturei was further subdivided into bailiwicks and Pflegeämter. In such an administrative sub-area, a corresponding official would be appointed. Most often it was the Knight brothers, Graumäntel, and secular servants of the Order who were chosen for this task. From their smaller castles, the appointed bailiffs of these Pflegeämter administered the territory under their control. They were the direct representative in the Order's handlings with the Prussians and new settlers. They held court, collected taxes, and established extensive agricultural estates under the Order's direct control. These lesser officials were more restricted in the execution of their duties than the Komturen under whose authority they ruled. Furthermore, there were specialized officials who served as masters of fisheries or forests and supervised the economic usage of these areas according to the rights and laws of the Order. The Teutonic Order did not only rely on its own members to administer their territory, for there were simply never enough brothers to do so. Thus, they also called upon noblemen from the Holy Roman Empire or Prussia to oversee their lands. Often these non-members were confined to lower jurisdictions and had to recognize the Order as their overlord and pay tribute to it, as well as perform military service. These same rules also applied to the Polish nobility who lived in some regions of Prussia. The difference between lands ruled by the Teutonic Order and lands ruled by the conventional nobility of medieval Europe lies in the fact that, unlike the nobility of Christendom, office holders in the Order did not hold their lands by hereditary right, and could have them revoked by the Order if necessary. In addition, the Order's territory was a contiguous dominion, so all administrative districts were subject to the same law as much as possible. This represented a drastic difference to large parts of Europe. where the rights of landlords could differ from region to region and even from village to village. The holders of the Order's offices were obliged to be accountable for their actions and local rule, which according to the Order's statutes had to be carried out in writing. The work of the individual commanderies was scrutinized through inspection visits by other, usually higher-ranking members of the Order. These visits were organized by the chapter of the Grand Master, and later, due to the expansion of the Order, by the chapters of Landmeisters and Landkomturen in Prussia. After the conquest of Prussia was achieved, the land was war-torn, devastated and depopulated. Thus, new settlers had to be acquired. To achieve this, the Order relied on the Knights of the so-called Kummerhandfeste, a town charter from 1233. This developed into a code of law called the Kummerrecht. This law was fundamental to attracting settlers into the Order's lands, for it granted the settlers of towns and newly founded villages free power of disposal regarding their property, while the Order was still the de facto owner of the land. These typically favorable conditions were offered to accelerate the migration process. In addition, excessive tax levies were prohibited, inheritance rights were favorable, and daughters were also entitled to inherit. All of this made settling in Teutonic Prussia very enticing. On the other hand, freemen settling in the Order's lands were obliged to serve in the army, with the contribution to the Order's armed forces being determined by their property. It was also taken into consideration that people who lived in the city could also own property in the countryside, and appropriate regulations were made. The Order's land also offered the special feature of extensive legal equality between town and country, as the Order provided the supreme lord of the court and landlord, who could be called upon by a bailiff. The legal status of the Old Prussians under the Teutonic Order's rule was quite diverse. The Prussians in this context were not the German Prussians of later history, but the indigenous Old Prussians, a native Baltic people, ancestrally related to modern Lithuanians and Latvians. After these Baltic Prussians were conquered by the German Teutonic Order, they kept living under their old established tribal Prussian warrior nobility. The unfree Prussian peasants had to pay taxes and perform a relatively large amount of service to their lords and the Order. The Prussian peasant was also only able to leave the land of his lord against a payment to his lord. The option of buying oneself's freedom was a possibility that was often utilized if one had the means to do so. When a Prussian bought his freedom, he could live under the more generous terms that the Order granted to new settlers. Prussians also settled in the towns of the country, but often formed the lower class there. Over time, this practice of buying one's freedom, together with the stream of newcomers from Middle and Western Europe, led to the assimilation of the Prussian people. The Brothers of the Order were aware of the importance of cities in their home regions. In particular, the fact that towns often acted as large castles that increased the defense potential of the Order's possessions was emphasized. In addition, cities emanated an economic advantage by providing a safe place for trade and crafts. The Order therefore promoted the founding of up to 93 cities and towns by 1410. These ranged from mostly small farming towns to large trading centers. Nevertheless, cities and walled towns remained a perpetually contentious part of the Order's holdings, for over time they could also jeopardize the Order's direct rule, as they were prone to developing autonomous mindsets and demanding political and mercantile rights, which ran counter to the tight ship the Order tried to run. In addition to the towns of so-called wild roots without a precedent structure, the Order created new towns in the immediate vicinity of the existing Prussian towns. These new towns remained under the direct control of the commanders, and thus represented an antithesis to the old Prussian towns. As we have seen, the Teutonic Order was at its core a military order like the Templar Knights or the Knights of St. John, and thus it developed a similar structure to those of other knightly orders. After all, why develop something new if you can base yourself on a working concept? However, the Teutonic Order differed from most other knightly orders in that it succeeded in establishing a coherent dominion, in which it itself, the Teutonic Order, was the center of power. Thus, the structure of the Teutonic Order also became the basis of governance of a de facto country. As a result of this, the Prussian domains of the Teutonic Order were unique, in that they contained nearly no nobility in the classic Western European style. The land and offices were not divided between different nobles. The soil which the farmer toiled and on which cities developed, and even the amber along the shores of the Baltic Sea, was the property of the Order, and the Order was the highest lord and judge in its lands. This policy, together with an attitude of superiority, would later be one of the core elements of the downfall of the order during the course of the 15th century. In the next video in this mini-series, we will talk about the Teutonic takeover of the Baltics. And special thanks again to War Thunder, the most diverse and authentic vehicle combat game out there. Get it for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox, with a massive bonus pack with loads of goodies if you're new or haven't played for 6 months, by signing up with our link in the description. Make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. Catch you